What if I told you that one woman's mind saved more lives than any general, any weapon, any army in World War II? That while men fought on beaches and in skies, a 20-year-old Cambridge mathematics graduate sat in a cold mansion in the English countryside, staring at seemingly random letters and saw patterns no one else could see. Her name was Joan Clark. The year was 1940. Nazi U-boats were drowning the Atlantic in blood, sinking supply ships faster than Britain could replace them. England was starving, isolated, months from surrender. And the German Enigma machine, a cipher device producing 159 million possible combinations, was considered unbreakable. But Joan Clark didn't believe in unbreakable. Working 18-hour shifts in Hut 8 at Bletchley Park alongside Alan Turing, she cracked the Nazi naval codes that turned the tide of the entire war. Yet, for 50 years, her story remained classified, erased, forgotten. If you want to know how one brilliant woman outsmarted Hitler's war machine and changed history forever, then subscribe now. This is her story. Joan Elizabeth Lowther. Clark was born on June 24, 1917 in London, into a world that didn't know what to do with brilliant women. Her father was a clergyman. Her mother believed a woman's place was in the home, not the classroom. But Joan saw the world differently. She saw it in patterns, sequences, mathematical puzzles that unfolded like flowers in her mind. While other girls played with dolls, Joan solved complex equations for fun. By age 16, she'd won a scholarship to Newnham College, Cambridge, one of only 2 women's colleges at the university. She studied mathematics under Gordon Welchman, a professor who recognized immediately that Joan possessed something rare: an intuitive understanding of cryptographic patterns, the ability to see order in chaos. She graduated in 1939 with top honors, achieving a double first, a perfect score. But Cambridge wouldn't give her a degree. Women weren't allowed to receive full degrees from Cambridge University until 1948. So, despite being one of the brightest mathematical minds in England, Joan Clark left university with a certificate, not a diploma, and no prospects for employment. The world was about to explode into war, and Joan was working as a low-paid clerical assistant, filing papers, wasting her genius. Then, in June 1940, everything changed. A letter arrived at her London flat. No return address. Inside, a single, typed sentence: "Your country needs your mathematical abilities for work of national importance. Report to Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. Tell no one." Joan stood in her small apartment, holding the letter, heart pounding. She had no idea what Bletchley Park was, no idea what work of national importance meant. But she knew this: England was losing the war. Hitler controlled Europe. U-boats were slaughtering merchant convoys in the Atlantic. Britain had months, maybe weeks, before starvation and invasion became inevitable. 3 days later, Joan Clark stepped off a train at Bletchley Station carrying a single suitcase and walked toward a Victorian mansion surrounded by wooden huts and barbed wire. She had no idea she was about to meet the strangest, most brilliant man she'd ever known, a mathematician named Alan Turing, who would change her life forever. Bletchley Park looked like a haunted estate from a Gothic novel. The main mansion was surrounded by hastily constructed wooden huts, each one housing different sections of Britain's most secret weapon, the government code and cipher school. Thousands of people worked here, and none of them were allowed to speak about what they did, even to each other. Joan was escorted past armed guards, through corridors filled with the clatter of typewriters and the hum of machinery she didn't recognize, until she reached Hut 8. The door opened, and she stepped into organized chaos. Dozens of people, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, hunched over tables covered in paper, scribbling furiously, arguing in hushed voices. The air smelled like stale coffee and cigarette smoke, and standing in the center of it all, staring at a chalkboard covered in incomprehensible symbols, was a tall, awkward man in a rumpled suit, muttering to himself. Alan Turing didn't look like a genius. He looked like someone who'd forgotten to sleep, eat, or comb his hair for a week. But when he turned and looked at Joan with those intense, burning eyes, she felt the weight of his intellect like gravity. "You're the Cambridge mathematician," Turing said, not a question. "Can you solve this?" He handed her a sheet of paper covered in 5-letter groups: RFKTM, BPXQZ, JNWJL. Random. Meaningless. "It's a German naval transmission," Turing explained. "Intercepted this morning. Somewhere in those letters is the location of a U-boat wolf pack heading for a convoy carrying food and fuel to Britain. If we don't decode it, in the next 6 hours, 3,000 tons of supplies and 200 sailors will be at the bottom of the Atlantic." Joan stared at the letters. Her mind began to work, sorting, testing, searching for patterns. "This is Enigma," she whispered. Turing nodded. "The Germans change the settings every day at midnight. We have machines, bombs, that can test thousands of possible rotor configurations, but they need human intuition to narrow the search space. That's where you come in." He pointed to a desk in the corner, piled with intercepts. "Welcome to HUD 8, Miss Clark. You have exactly 6 hours to help me save those men." Joan sat down, picked up a pencil, and got to work, not knowing she'd just joined the most important team in the war. The Enigma machine was a monster. A typewriter-sized device with 3 rotors, a plug board, and a reflector that scrambled every letter through millions of possible paths. When a German operator typed a message, the machine encrypted it into gibberish. The receiving operator, using the exact same settings, could decrypt it perfectly. But without knowing the daily settings, which rotors, which positions, which plugboard connections, breaking Enigma was mathematically impossible. Except Alan Turing had found a crack in the armor. German radio operators were human. They made mistakes. They got lazy. They reused phrases. Weather report always appeared at the start of morning transmissions. Heil Hitler ended official orders. These were cribs, predictable patterns that gave codebreakers a foothold. Joan's job was to find them. She sat at her desk in Hut 8, surrounded by intercepts, searching for patterns in chaos. Her eyes ached, her hands cramped from writing, but slowly, methodically, she began to see the ghosts hiding in the static, repeating. Letter groups, frequency distributions, places where randomness wasn't quite random enough. "Here," she said, sliding a paper toward Turing. "This 5-letter group appears in the same position in 3 different transmissions. It's probably a weather station identifier." Turing studied it, eyes widening. "Brilliant. That narrows the rotor positions by 60%. He rushed to the bomb machine, a massive electromechanical computer the size of a wardrobe, clicking and whirring as it tested thousands of Enigma configurations per minute. Joan watched the machine work, fascinated and terrified. If they were wrong, the convoy would sail straight into a U-boat ambush. Hours passed. The bomb kept running. Then, suddenly, it stopped. A bell rang. Turing tore the paper from the machine and started decrypting. His hands were shaking. Joan held her breath. German words appeared. Grid. Reference M47 2-1. Convoy intercept 0600 hours. They had it. The location of the wolf pack. Turing grabbed the phone, barking coordinates to naval intelligence. Within the hour, British destroyers would be racing to intercept. Joan slumped in her chair, exhausted, exhilarated. Turing looked at her with something like respect. "Miss Clark, I think you might be the best cryptanalyst I've ever worked with." But Joan barely heard him. She was staring at another intercept that had just arrived, and what she saw there made her blood turn cold. The intercept was different, longer, more complex, and it came with a priority stamp from the Admiralty. Urgent. Possible major operation. Joan spread the transmission across her desk. Standard 5-letter groups, but something was wrong. The frequency distribution was off. The cribs they normally relied on weren't appearing in the expected positions. Turing tried running it through the bomb with every known setting. Nothing worked. "It's not decrypting," Turing muttered, pacing like a caged animal. "Either our cribs are wrong or they've changed the machine," Joan finished. The room went silent. Everyone in Hut 8 understood what that meant. If the Germans had upgraded Enigma, every technique they'd developed over the past year was suddenly useless. The blackout would return. U-boats would hunt freely. Britain would starve. Joan studied the message for hours, searching for any pattern, any weakness. Her colleagues went home. Turing collapsed at his desk, asleep. But Joan kept working, driven by something beyond exhaustion, the certainty that this message was important, that lives depended on breaking it. At 3 in the morning, she saw it, a tiny anomaly. In standard Enigma, certain letter combinations were impossible because of how the reflector worked. A letter could never encrypt to itself. But in this transmission she found instances where it seemed like it had. "Alan," she whispered, shaking Turing awake. "What if they've added a fourth rotor?" Turing's eyes went wide. "That would multiply the combinations by 26. We'd need a completely new approach." But Joan was already calculating, her pencil flying across paper, building a new mathematical framework. If the Germans had added a fourth rotor, they'd made the machine more complex, but also more predictable in certain edge cases. She could exploit that. By dawn, she had a working theory. By noon, they'd modified the bomb settings. By evening, the message broke open, and what they read made every person in Hut 8 freeze in horror. It was an operational order for something called Operation Drumbeat, a coordinated U-boat assault on American shipping along the eastern seaboard. Launch date, December 1941. The target list included 50 merchant vessels, tankers carrying fuel for Britain's survival. If this operation succeeded, the war would be over by spring. Joan stood in the cold December air outside Hut 8, staring at the stars, trying to process what she'd just helped uncover. 50 ships. Thousands of men. She knew their deaths were coming, knew the exact coordinates where U-boats would be waiting, knew the precise hour the torpedoes would launch. But here was the terrible calculus of intelligence work. If Britain acted on every decoded message, the Germans would realize Enigma was compromised. They'd change everything, and the blackout would return forever. So sometimes, God help them, they had to let ships sink, let men die, to protect the greater secret. Turing found her outside, offered her a cigarette. She didn't smoke, but took it anyway. "The Admiralty wants to know how much we can act on without exposing Ultra," Turing said quietly. Ultra was the code name for all intelligence derived from Enigma. "They're asking us to choose which convoys live and which die." Joan's hands were shaking. "We're mathematicians, Alan, not gods." "No," Turing agreed. "But we're the only ones who can see the future. That makes us responsible for it." The decision came down from Churchill himself. Reroute 3 convoys using plausible cover, claiming reconnaissance aircraft had spotted U-boat activity. Let 2 convoys sail as planned, to maintain the illusion that British intelligence was merely lucky, not omniscient. Joan sat at her desk that night, knowing that in 72 hours, 2 ships on her list would explode, and she'd done nothing to stop it. The guilt was crushing, but she also knew the larger truth. By breaking Enigma, by maintaining the secret, they were saving tens of thousands more lives than they sacrificed. That's when Turing did something unexpected. He sat beside her and said, "Joan, I need to ask you something. After the war, when they ask us what we did, we won't be able to tell them. This work will stay classified for decades. No medals, no recognition. History won't remember your name. Can you live with that?" Joan looked at him, at this strange, brilliant man who understood her better than anyone ever had. "If it means we win," she said quietly, "I can live with anything." What Joan didn't know was that the hardest test was still coming, and it would force her to make an impossible choice. March 1944. Hut 8 had been breaking German naval Enigma for 3 years. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning. U-boat losses were mounting. Allied convoys were getting through. Victory felt, for the first time, possible. Then the intercepts went silent. Not gradually, overnight. Every German naval transmission suddenly became unbreakable again. New rotor settings, new plugboard configurations, patterns that made no mathematical sense. It was as if the Germans knew exactly how Bletchley's bombs worked and had designed their new system specifically to defeat them. The implication was terrifying. There was a leak. Mi-5 arrived within hours. Security officers interrogated everyone, searched desks, confiscated papers. The atmosphere in Hut 8 turned poisonous with suspicion. Turing became paranoid, trusting no one. Joan watched brilliant colleagues, people she'd worked alongside for years, get escorted away for questioning and never return. Then they found it. A stack of Enigma worksheets hidden inside a maintenance locker, copies of Joan's own crib analyses, her pattern recognition techniques, her mathematical frameworks for narrowing bomb searches. Someone had been photographing classified documents and preparing to smuggle them out. The security chief called Joan into an interrogation room. He laid the papers on the table between them. "These are your handwriting, Miss Clark." Joan's heart stopped. "Yes, but I didn't." "We found them in a locker used by one of the maintenance staff. A man named Peter Carlyle. He's been here since 1941. You've worked with him, spoken to him regularly." Joan remembered Carlyle. Quiet, helpful, always volunteering to work late shifts, always nearby when she was analyzing intercepts. "He befriended you," the officer continued. "Gained your trust. You were his target, Miss Clark. The Germans wanted your methods, and he used you to get them." The betrayal cut deeper than Joan expected. She'd been careful, followed every security protocol, but Carlyle had been watching, learning, copying, and now, because of her, the Germans had rebuilt their defenses. "How bad is it?" she whispered. The officer's face was grim. "D-Day is 60 days away. If we can't break their new Atlantic codes before the invasion, the German Navy will slaughter our landing forces in the Channel." Joan looked at the papers. Her work, weaponized against her own side, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Joan didn't sleep for 3 days. She cleared her desk of everything except blank paper, pencils, and the new German intercepts that mocked her with their impenetrability. The rest of Hut 8 had moved on to other problems, accepting that the naval codes were lost. But Joan couldn't accept it. 60 days until D-Day. 60 days until the largest amphibious invasion in history launched across the English Channel, and if German U-boats and destroyers knew it was coming, the beaches would run red. She started over, from first principles, forgot everything she knew about the old Enigma system, and looked at the new intercepts with fresh eyes. The Germans thought they'd outsmarted Bletchley by changing their procedures, but Joan realized they'd made a fatal mistake. In their rush to implement the new system, they'd kept one thing the same: the weather station identifiers. Those predictable 5-letter codes that appeared at the start of every morning transmission. Joan's hands trembled as she circled them. If the Germans were still using the same weather cribs, she could reverse engineer the new rotor positions from there. It would take thousands of calculations, weeks of work. But it was possible. She barely left Hut 8. Alan Turing brought her coffee, sandwiches she forgot to eat. Her colleagues watched her work with a mixture of awe and concern. This brilliant woman who'd been betrayed, now working herself to death to fix what someone else had broken. 2 weeks before D-Day, Joan broke the new system. The bomb clicked to life, processing her new analytical framework, and suddenly the intercepts were readable again. German naval positions, U-boat patrol routes, destroyer deployments. It was all there, laid bare. But what Joan saw made her blood freeze. The Germans knew something big was coming. They didn't know when or where, but they'd positioned 60 U-boats in a defensive arc across the Channel approaches. If the Allied invasion fleet sailed into that cordon, it would be a massacre that would make Dunkirk look like a skirmish. Joan ran the numbers. With current deployment patterns, the Germans would intercept the invasion fleet 6 hours after launch. 1,800 ships, 150,000 men. all sailing into a trap. Unless Joan worked through the night, mapping German patrol patterns, finding the gaps, the narrow corridors where the invasion could slip through undetected. She created a minute-by-minute timeline. If the fleet launched at exactly 0630 hours on June 6th, sailed along this specific route, maintained radio silence, they could thread between the U-boat pickets and reach the beaches before the Germans realized what was happening. She handed her analysis to Admiral Ramsay, the man coordinating the naval invasion. He stared at the papers, then at Joan. "Miss Clark, you're telling me the success of the entire invasion depends on your calculations being correct?" Joan met his eyes. "Yes, sir. To the minute." On June 6, 1944, at 0630 hours, 5,000 ships launched from English ports and sailed toward Normandy. Joan stood in Hut 8, listening to radio intercepts, tracking German reactions in real time. For 6 hours, the German Navy didn't realize an invasion was underway. By the time they scrambled their U-boats, Allied forces were already ashore, air superiority established, the beachhead secured. D-Day succeeded. 150,000 men landed. The liberation of Europe began, and Joan Clark's role in making it possible remained classified. The war ended in May 1945. Bletchley Park shut down. Everyone signed the Official Secrets Act, swearing never to speak of what they'd done. Joan returned to civilian life, took a position teaching mathematics at a girls' school, and watched the world celebrate heroes whose names she knew: Montgomery, Eisenhower, Churchill, while the real heroes, the code breakers, vanished into silence. She never married Alan Turing. He proposed once in 1941, and she accepted, but he broke it off weeks later, confessing he was homosexual and couldn't live a lie. Joan understood. They remained friends until Turing's death in 1954, a death Joan always suspected wasn't suicide but something darker.